men confronted the fundamental problem of human existence and arrived at opposite conclusions. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and the Indian sage Siddhartha Gautama both recognized suffering as central to life. Both diagnosed nihilism as humanity's deepest crisis. Both rejected conventional morality and religious comfort. Yet their responses diverged so radically that Nietzsche called himself the anti-Buddha of Europe. This confrontation reveals more than historical curiosity. These two figures represent fundamentally incompatible visions of what it means to be human. Their disagreement cuts to the core of existence itself. Nietzsche encountered Buddhism through the filtered lens of Arthur Schopenhauer's pessimistic interpretation. Schopenhauer had championed Indian philosophy as confirmation of his own doctrine of world negation. Nietzsche studied Sanskrit at Leipzig between 1865 and 1868 under Hermann Brockhaus. He read Hermann Oldenburg's Buddha and Friedrich Koppen's Die Religion des Buddha. He absorbed Buddhist concepts with surprising depth for his era. Yet his understanding remained coloured by Schopenhauer's metaphysical framework. The Buddha taught that existence is marked by three characteristics: impermanence, suffering, and no permanent self. All phenomena arise through dependent origination, meaning nothing exists independently. The self you experience is merely five aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These aggregates constantly change and interact through causal chains. Clinging to these temporary aggregates as a permanent self generates suffering. Nietzsche identified the core problem as the death of God and the resulting nihilism. Traditional values had collapsed, leaving humans without meaning or purpose. The challenge was not to escape existence, but to affirm it completely. His solution involved the will to power, eternal recurrence, and the creation of new values. Life should not be denied or transcended, but embraced in its entirety. Both thinkers developed what scholar Antoine Panayotti calls great health perfectionism, therapeutic approaches to human suffering. Both rejected the concepts of sin, guilt, and divine judgment prevalent in Abrahamic religions. Both emphasized psychological rather than theological frameworks for understanding human problems. Both viewed existence as characterized by constant flux and change. Yet Nietzsche saw Buddhism as a sophisticated form of nihilism that ultimately denied life. He interpreted nirvana as a will to nothingness, an escape from existence itself. This interpretation, scholars now recognize, fundamentally misunderstood Buddhist doctrine. The Buddha explicitly rejected both eternalism and nihilism as extreme views. The genuine differences between these philosophies run deeper than Nietzsche's misinterpretation. They disagree about whether existence should be affirmed or transcended. They diverge on whether suffering can be eliminated or must be embraced. They offer conflicting accounts of what constitutes human flourishing. Modern neuroscience, evolutionary biology, and cognitive science have illuminated both positions in unexpected ways. Buddhist meditation practices have been validated through brain imaging studies. Nietzsche's insights about unconscious drives preceded Freud and align with contemporary psychology. Both anticipated aspects of how the mind actually functions. This analysis examines their core arguments, underlying assumptions, and practical implications. It explores how their ideas developed historically and influenced later thinkers. It reveals the reasoning chains behind each position and the critiques each faces. Most importantly, it asks which philosophy offers a more accurate and viable response to human existence. Part 1. The Diagnostic Agreement. Both Nietzsche and Buddha begin with a shared recognition. Human beings suffer unnecessarily. This suffering does not stem from external circumstances alone, but from internal misunderstandings. Both identify a fundamental crisis in how humans relate to existence. Both see conventional religious and moral frameworks as inadequate or actively harmful. The Buddha's diagnosis emerged from his biographical encounter with aging, sickness, and death. Prince Siddhartha lived in luxury until confronting human mortality at age 29. This shock prompted his renunciation and 6 years of ascetic practice. His enlightenment under the Bodhi tree revealed the Four Noble Truths. First, life is characterized by dukkha, often translated as suffering, but more accurately meaning unsatisfactoriness. Second, this suffering arises from tanha, craving or thirst. Third, suffering can cease through the elimination of craving. Fourth, the Eightfold Path provides the method for this cessation. The Buddha's analysis identifies craving as the root mechanism generating suffering. Humans crave sensory pleasures, continued existence, and non-existence. This craving operates through a 12-link chain of dependent origination. Ignorance conditions mental formations, which condition consciousness, which conditions name and form. This process continues through 6 sense bases: contact, feeling, craving, clinging, becoming, birth, and finally aging and death. Each link arises dependent on the previous link. The doctrine of anatta, no permanent self, stands as Buddhism's most distinctive and challenging claim. The Buddha taught that what we call the self is merely a convenient designation. No permanent, unchanging essence exists within the 5 aggregates. The feeling of being a continuous self is an illusion generated by rapidly changing mental and physical processes. This illusion causes us to cling desperately to what cannot be held. Modern neuroscience has confirmed aspects of this Buddhist insight about selfhood. The brain constructs the sense of a unified self from distributed neural processes. Neurologist Antonio Damasio's research shows the self emerges from basic homeostatic regulations and body mapping. Split brain studies demonstrate that consciousness can be divided, challenging the unity of self. Research on memory shows it is reconstructive rather than reproductive, undermining the continuity of personal identity. The Buddha emphasized that this analysis is not nihilistic or pessimistic. Understanding dependent origination and no self does not mean nothing exists. It means phenomena exist only in dependence on causes and conditions. This recognition liberates rather than depresses because it shows suffering is not inherent or inevitable. Nirvana is not annihilation, but the cessation of the processes that generate suffering. Nietzsche's diagnosis emerged from a different historical and philosophical context. He witnessed what he called the death of God in 19th century Europe. Traditional Christian morality no longer commanded genuine belief among educated Europeans. This created what Nietzsche termed a nihilist crisis of unprecedented magnitude. Without God, traditional values lacked foundation and meaning seemed impossible. Nietzsche identified 3 ways nihilism manifests as a psychological state. First, people seek a purpose or telos in existence that simply does not exist. Christianity had provided this through salvation and eternal life. Its collapse left existence appearing pointless. Second, people project a unity or wholeness onto the world that it lacks. They want the cosmos to be rational, orderly, and ultimately benevolent. Third, people believe in a true world beyond this apparent world. This true world would have been eternal, unchanging, and morally perfect. The death of God forced recognition that no transcendent meaning exists. No divine plan guides history toward a glorious conclusion. No cosmic justice ensures that virtue is rewarded and vice punished. No eternal soul survives death to receive ultimate vindication. These comforting illusions had sustained human beings for millennia. Their collapse threatened to plunge European civilization into despair and destructive nihilism. Nietzsche saw 2 possible responses to this crisis: passive nihilism or active nihilism. Passive nihilism involves resignation, exhaustion, and the will to nothingness. It seeks escape from existence through distraction, intoxication, or annihilation. Active nihilism involves the creative destruction of old values and the affirmation of life. It embraces the void and uses it as an opportunity for radical freedom. Crucially, Nietzsche interpreted Buddhism as an instance of passive nihilism. He viewed nirvana as a will to nothingness, a sophisticated form of world denial. Compassion, from his perspective, merely spreads suffering by making us assume others' pain. Buddhist practice aimed at eliminating desire, which Nietzsche saw as life negation. The entire system appeared designed to escape existence rather than affirm it. This interpretation, scholars have demonstrated, fundamentally misread Buddhist philosophy. Nietzsche inherited Schopenhauer's conflation of Buddhist and Hindu concepts. Schopenhauer had projected his own pessimism onto Eastern thought. He read Buddhist texts through the lens of his will as chaotic, aimless striving. The Buddha explicitly rejected nihilism in numerous suttas. When asked if nothing exists after death, he refused to answer, calling it an improper question. Nirvana is not nothingness, but the unconditioned, beyond both existence and non-existence as conventionally understood. The cessation of craving does not mean the elimination of all desire, only harmful forms rooted in ignorance. Nevertheless, Nietzsche's misreading reveals a genuine philosophical disagreement beneath the misunderstanding. Even correctly understood, Buddhism seeks to extinguish certain fundamental drives that Nietzsche considered essential to life. The Buddha taught that craving must be eliminated for liberation. Nietzsche insisted that drives, including aggressive and acquisitive ones, constitute life itself. Both thinkers diagnosed a sickness in how humans ordinarily relate to existence. Both viewed conventional morality and religion as symptoms rather than cures. Both emphasized direct experiential understanding over abstract theoretical knowledge. Both developed practices aimed at transforming consciousness and alleviating suffering. The Buddha prescribed meditation, ethical conduct, and wisdom cultivation as the path to liberation. Samatha meditation develops concentration and mental stability. Vipassana meditation cultivates insight into impermanence, suffering, and no self. Ethical precepts restrain harmful actions that disturb the mind. Together, these practices gradually weaken the bonds of craving and ignorance. Nietzsche prescribed what we might call existential self-overcoming. One must acknowledge the death of God and the resulting void without flinching. One must then create one's own values through an act of will. This requires embracing the eternal recurrence. Would you will the exact return of your life forever? Only those who could answer yes have truly overcome nihilism and affirmed existence. The concept of will to power stands at the center of Nietzsche's positive philosophy. This remains one of his most misunderstood and contested ideas. Will to power is not simply the desire to dominate others, though it includes that possibility. More fundamentally, it describes a drive to overcome resistance, to grow, and to expand one's capacities. Nietzsche sometimes presented will to power as a cosmological principle underlying all reality. In his unpublished notebooks, he speculated that the world itself consists of will to power and nothing else. Most scholars now interpret this more modestly as a psychological principle describing human motivation. People naturally seek to increase their power, understood as the capacity for action and self-determination. Alfred Adler, founder of individual psychology, explicitly borrowed from Nietzsche's will to power concept. Adler argued that humans have an innate drive towards superiority and overcoming feelings of inferiority. Contemporary psychology recognizes related phenomena in concepts like self-efficacy and achievement motivation. The drive to master challenges and develop competencies appears fundamental to human psychology. The Buddha would have recognized this drive, but interpreted it very differently. From a Buddhist perspective, will to power represents a refined form of craving for becoming. It seeks to establish and expand the sense of self through accomplishments and dominance. This inevitably generates suffering because all constructed identities are impermanent and ultimately unsatisfying. Nietzsche countered that this Buddhist solution involves a will to power turned against itself. The ascetic seeks power over himself, power to overcome his own nature and desires. Even the ideal of egolessness requires tremendous will and self-discipline. Paradoxically, the Buddhist path demands the very drives it claims to eliminate. Both diagnose suffering as stemming from a mismatch between human psychology and reality. For Buddha, we suffer because we crave permanence in an impermanent world. We seek stable identity in a process of constant change. We pursue pleasures that inevitably turn to pain. For Nietzsche, we suffer because we demand that existence have meaning it does not possess. We want cosmic justice when the universe operates without moral purpose. We seek eternal truths when everything is interpretation and perspective. We cling to comforting lies when honesty demands we face harsh realities. Part 2. The Great Divergence. Their opposing solutions. The fundamental split between Nietzsche and Buddha emerges in their responses to suffering. Both recognize the problem, but their prescriptions oppose each other at every level. The Buddha prescribed extinction of craving through the Eightfold Path. Nietzsche prescribed intensification of life through eternal affirmation. The Eightfold Path consists of right view, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. These 8 factors divide into 3 categories: wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. Right view means understanding the 4 noble truths and dependent origination. Right intention involves renouncing worldly attachments, cultivating goodwill, and avoiding harm. The ethical components regulate behavior to reduce harm and mental disturbance. The meditative components develop concentration and penetrating insight into reality. This path aims at nirvana, literally meaning extinction or blowing out. What is extinguished are the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. Nirvana is not a place or state of being, but the unconditioned beyond space and time. It cannot be adequately described in conceptual terms because it transcends ordinary categories. The Buddha used negative descriptions. It is not born, not made, not conditioned. Positively, it represents complete liberation from the cycle of suffering and rebirth. Scholars have long debated whether nirvana constitutes annihilation or transformation. Early Western interpreters often read it as simple extinction of consciousness. This interpretation influenced Schopenhauer and through him Nietzsche. Contemporary Buddhist studies emphasize that nirvana is neither existence nor non-existence, as ordinarily conceived. The Buddha refused to answer whether an enlightened being exists after death, calling such questions improper. They assume categories that do not apply to one who has transcended all categories. Nietzsche interpreted this transcendence as world denial and life negation. From his perspective, Buddhism represented an advanced case of decadence and exhaustion. It emerged from a tired, over-refined civilization that had lost its vital instincts. The Buddhist solution involved withdrawing from life rather than mastering it. His alternative centered on 3 interconnected concepts: will to power, eternal recurrence, and amor fati. These form what scholar Antoine Panayotti calls Nietzsche's positive philosophy of life affirmation. Amor fati means love of fate, the attitude of embracing everything that happens. Nietzsche wrote in Exe Homo that his formula for human greatness is amor fati. One wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. This goes beyond stoic resignation or passive acceptance. It demands active love for necessity, including suffering, failure, and loss. One must not merely bear what is necessary, but actively love it. This attitude connects intimately with the doctrine of eternal recurrence. Eternal recurrence presents a thought experiment with profound psychological implications. Suppose a demon told you that your life will repeat infinitely exactly as it is. Every joy and pain, every triumph and humiliation would return in identical sequence forever. How would you respond to this prospect? Would you gnash your teeth in despair or proclaim the demon divine? Most scholars interpret eternal recurrence as an attitudinal test rather than a cosmological claim. Nietzsche did attempt to prove it physically in his unpublished notebooks. He argued that if time is infinite but matter finite, all configurations must eventually repeat. This reasoning fails because it ignores thermodynamics and assumes deterministic causation. The philosophical significance lies not in its physical truth, but its psychological impact. Someone who embraces eternal recurrence affirms their entire life without reservation. They would change nothing, even if given the opportunity. This represents the ultimate affirmation of existence against nihilism. Only those capable of this total affirmation have truly overcome the death of God. They no longer need transcendent meaning because they embrace immanent reality completely. Nietzsche argued that amor fati and eternal recurrence require tremendous strength. Most people flee from existence into comforting illusions like heaven or nirvana. They cannot bear the weight of existence without transcendent justification. They need to believe suffering serves some ultimate purpose or can be permanently escaped. The Buddha would have recognized this flight from reality, but diagnosed it differently. From a Buddhist perspective, clinging to existence represents the problem, not the solution. Nietzsche's eternal affirmation perpetuates the very craving that generates suffering. It embraces becoming rather than recognizing its ultimately unsatisfactory nature. Buddhist texts distinguish three types of craving: for sensual pleasure, for existence, and for non-existence. Nietzsche's philosophy represents refined craving for existence taken to its logical extreme. Instead of eliminating the thirst that creates suffering, it intensifies and glorifies it. This guarantees continued bondage to the cycle of dissatisfaction. Nietzsche countered that Buddhism's solution involves a subtle form of resentment. Resentment means reactive hostility born from powerlessness and perceived injury. Unable to affirm life, the weak declare life itself to be the problem. They transform their weakness into apparent strength through renunciation and asceticism. Buddhism thus represents slave morality dressed in philosophical sophistication. This critique reveals a fundamental axiological disagreement about what constitutes value. For Nietzsche, power, growth, and self-overcoming represent the highest values. Life should be judged by its intensity, creativity, and capacity for affirmation. Suffering is not inherently bad, but rather the precondition for greatness. Only through struggle and overcoming resistance do humans achieve excellence. For the Buddha, these values themselves arise from ignorance and craving. The pursuit of power and excellence rests on the false assumption of a substantial self. This self must be aggrandized, defended, and perpetually maintained through achievements. But since no such self exists, this entire project is fundamentally misguided. It resembles building an elaborate house on quicksand, doomed to collapse. The practical implications of these opposing solutions diverge dramatically. Buddhist practice involves gradual cultivation of mindfulness, concentration, and insight. Meditators observe mental and physical phenomena arising and passing away. Through sustained observation, they directly experience impermanence, suffering, and no self. This experiential understanding, not mere intellectual knowledge, produces liberation. Thousands of hours of meditation practice typically precede significant attainments. The path requires renunciation of worldly pursuits to varying degrees. Monks and nuns adopt celibacy, poverty, and intensive practice schedules. Laypeople maintain ethical precepts and develop concentration through regular meditation. The entire Buddhist tradition emphasizes gradual training and incremental progress. Nietzsche's path involves no systematic practice or institutional framework. He provides no meditation techniques, no ethical precepts, no community support. His philosophy demands individual self-creation through an act of radical freedom. One must become who one is by embracing one's fundamental nature and drives. This requires honest self-examination, courage to face harsh truths, and creative valor. The Nietzschean path emphasizes activity, struggle, and engagement with the world. Rather than withdrawing into meditation, one should immerse oneself in creative projects. Art, philosophy, politics, and cultural innovation provide arenas for self-overcoming. Suffering should not be eliminated, but transformed into fuel for achievement. These opposing approaches reflect different conceptions of human nature and possibility. Buddhism views craving as a removable defilement, obscuring our true nature. With sufficient practice, the mind can be purified and liberated. This optimism about human perfectibility underlies the entire soteriological project. Nietzsche views drives as constitutive of human nature, not removable imperfections. We are fundamentally beings of will to power, desiring and striving. Any attempt to eliminate these drives would destroy what makes us human. The question is not whether to have drives, but how to organize and direct them. Modern psychology offers evidence supporting aspects of both positions. Buddhist meditation demonstrably reduces suffering and increases well-being. Brain imaging studies show meditation alters neural activity in regions associated with emotion regulation. Long-term practitioners exhibit increased grey matter density in areas linked to attention and emotional control. These findings validate the Buddhist claim that mental training can fundamentally alter consciousness. Simultaneously, evolutionary psychology confirms that basic drives are deeply embedded in human nature. The desire for status, the pleasure in overcoming challenges and aggressive impulses served adaptive functions. Complete elimination of such drives would require altering our biological architecture at fundamental levels. This suggests Nietzsche correctly identified drives as constitutive rather than removable. Perhaps the deepest disagreement concerns whether existence itself should be affirmed or transcended. Nietzsche demands we say yes to life in its totality, including its horrors. The Buddha teaches that all conditioned existence is ultimately unsatisfactory and should be transcended. These represent genuinely incompatible existential orientations. Nietzsche accused Buddhism of nihilism because it seeks to extinguish rather than transform suffering. Yet the Buddha explicitly rejected nihilism as a wrong view. Nirvana is not nothing, but rather the unconditioned that stands beyond existence and non-existence. This distinction, however subtle, matters crucially for understanding Buddhist metaphysics. From the Buddhist perspective, Nietzsche's eternal affirmation represents a sophisticated form of ignorance. It clings to becoming and change as ultimate when they are merely conditioned phenomena. True wisdom recognizes the unconditioned that transcends the entire realm of flux. Nietzsche's philosophy mistakes the prison for freedom by learning to love the chains. Part 3. Metaphysical Foundations, Reality, Self and Existence. The clash between Nietzsche and Buddha extends to fundamental questions about reality's nature. Their divergent metaphysics determine everything else in their philosophies. The Buddha developed a sophisticated metaphysical system centered on dependent origination. Nietzsche rejected traditional metaphysics while offering his own vision of reality as will to power. Buddhist metaphysics divides phenomena into conditioned and unconditioned realms. Everything in ordinary experience belongs to the conditioned realm of samsara. These phenomena arise dependent on causes and conditions according to natural laws. The principle of dependent origination explains how everything emerges through causal relationships. The 12 links of dependent origination describe the cycle of suffering and rebirth. Ignorance conditions, mental formations, consciousness, name and form, 6 sense bases, contact, feeling, craving, clinging, becoming, birth, and finally aging and death. Each link arises dependent on the previous link in a continuous causal chain. Understanding this chain reveals how suffering originates and how it can cease. This metaphysics denies any first cause or ultimate origin point. Asking what existed before dependent origination represents a category error. Causation itself is simply how phenomena manifest. There is no need for an external creator. The chain has no beginning in time, though individuals can escape it through enlightenment. Dependent origination implies that nothing possesses independent existence or inherent nature. All phenomena are empty of svabhava, meaning intrinsic essence or self-nature. This emptiness doctrine, elaborated extensively in Mahayana philosophy, extends beyond personal selflessness to all phenomena. Even dharmas, the basic constituents of experience, lack independent existence. The Madhyamaka school, founded by Nagarjuna, developed this emptiness doctrine most rigorously. Nagarjuna demonstrated through logical analysis that all concepts dissolve under scrutiny. Whatever exists only conventionally through linguistic and conceptual designation. Ultimate reality transcends all conceptual elaboration and cannot be captured in thought. Nietzsche would have appreciated this anti-foundational thrust while rejecting its ultimate goal. He too argued against the possibility of grasping reality as it truly is. All knowledge involves interpretation shaped by human needs and perspectives. There are no facts, only interpretations, as he famously declared. His epistemological skepticism emerged from his reading of Kant and Schopenhauer. Kant had argued that we only know phenomena as they appear, never things in themselves. Nietzsche radicalized this by rejecting even the concept of things in themselves. If we can never know something, why posit its existence at all? This led Nietzsche to a form of perspectivism, All views are perspectives from particular standpoints. No God's eye view exists from which to survey reality objectively. Even science represents one perspective among others, shaped by particular interests and values. Its claim to objectivity masks a will to power over nature through prediction and control. Nietzsche sometimes described reality as will to power and nothing else. This might suggest a metaphysical theory replacing God or atoms with a universal force. Most scholars interpret this more modestly as a heuristic principle for understanding phenomena. Viewing events through the lens of power relations often proves more illuminating than traditional categories. The concept of will to power as metaphysics faces severe problems. If everything is will to power, the concept becomes vacuous and explains nothing. Nietzsche himself remained ambiguous about whether he intended a genuine cosmological theory. His unpublished notebooks contain speculation, but his published works mostly apply will to power psychologically. Both thinkers rejected substance metaphysics that posits enduring things underlying changing properties. For Buddha, this rejection follows from dependent origination and emptiness. No substances exist, only processes arising through causal relationships. What appears as a person is actually 5 aggregates in constant flux. For Nietzsche, this rejection follows from becoming as ultimate reality. He championed Heraclitus's view that everything flows and nothing remains the same. The world is not a being, but a becoming perpetual change without fixed essence. Attempts to freeze this flux into stable concepts falsify reality's dynamic nature. The doctrine of eternal recurrence complicates Nietzsche's metaphysics of pure becoming. If everything recurs identically, this suggests a cyclic structure incompatible with pure flux. Nietzsche never resolved this tension between becoming and eternal return. Some scholars argue eternal recurrence should not be taken literally as metaphysics. Others contend Nietzsche genuinely believed in cosmic recurrence based on physical considerations. The personal self becomes a central metaphysical battleground between these philosophies. Buddhist anatta doctrine denies any permanent, unchanging self or soul. What we call self is merely 5 aggregates arising and passing away, moment by moment. Form refers to physical body and material elements. Feeling includes pleasant, unpleasant and neutral sensations. Perception involves recognizing and interpreting sensory data. Mental formations encompass volitions, intentions and emotional responses. Consciousness is awareness of objects through the 6 sense doors. None of these aggregates constitutes a self because each is impermanent and dependent. Form constantly changes through metabolic processes and aging. Feelings arise dependent on contact between sense organs and objects. Perceptions vary based on past conditioning and present circumstances. Mental formations come and go as transient mental events. Consciousness requires an object and sense faculty to exist. Modern neuroscience has provided remarkable confirmation of the Buddhist view. The sense of a unified self emerges from distributed brain processes without any central controller. Neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga's split brain research revealed that consciousness can be divided. Each Each hemisphere generates its own stream of awareness when the corpus callosum is severed. This demonstrates that the unity of self is constructed rather than given. Research on neural correlates of consciousness shows no single location where the self resides. Instead, various brain regions coordinate to produce the sense of being a unified subject. The default mode network activates during self-referential thinking and autobiographical memory. But this network is not the self. It is merely brain activity associated with self-representation. Studies of memory further undermine the continuity of personal identity over time. Memory is reconstructive, constantly shaped by present concerns and later experiences. What we remember about our past changes based on who we are now. The person you were 10 years ago differs so dramatically that personal identity across time becomes questionable. Philosopher Derek Parfit developed a Buddhist-inspired theory of personal identity based on psychological continuity. He argued that apart from causally connected mental and physical events, no separately existing self exists. This reductionist view eliminates the deep further fact of personal identity beyond physical and psychological continuity. Parfit explicitly noted that Buddha would have agreed with this analysis. Nietzsche approached the self-question from a different angle, but reached similar conclusions. He rejected the notion of a unified, rational subject that thinks and acts. The self is not a being, but a plurality of drives competing for dominance. What we call consciousness is merely surface-level awareness of conflicts occurring in unconscious depths. His psychological model anticipated Freud's theory of unconscious motivation by decades. Most mental activity occurs below the threshold of conscious awareness. Conscious thoughts and decisions are often rationalizations of unconscious drives. The feeling of free will is an illusion generated by ignorance of true causes. This makes the self more like a political regime than a unified agent. Various drives struggle for power, forming temporary alliances and coalitions. What we call character is simply which drives have achieved dominance and organized the personality. A strong person is one whose drives are well organized under a hierarchy. A weak person is one whose drives remain chaotic and conflicting. Both Nietzsche and Buddha thus reject the substantial self of traditional philosophy. Yet their reasons and implications differ significantly. Buddha rejects self to enable liberation from suffering through non-clinging. Nietzsche rejects self to enable creative self-fashioning through drive organization. For Buddha, recognizing no self leads to reduced suffering and peaceful detachment. One ceases identifying with the body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. This non-identification prevents the arising of craving based on self-concern. Without a self to protect or aggrandize, many sources of anxiety dissolve. For Nietzsche, recognizing multiple drives enables conscious self-creation. One can examine which drives dominate and decide whether this arrangement serves higher goals. The task becomes organizing one's drives into a coherent, powerful hierarchy. This requires strength to impose order on the chaos of competing impulses. The metaphysical status of consciousness itself divides these thinkers. Buddhist Abhidhamma philosophy analyzes consciousness into discrete moments arising and passing away. Each moment of consciousness depends on an object and a sense faculty. Consciousness is not a thing but a process, empty of inherent existence like all phenomena. The Yogacara school developed this into a sophisticated, idealist phenomenology. Nietzsche viewed consciousness as a relatively recent evolutionary development. It arose to facilitate social coordination and communication among humans. Most of what we do requires no consciousness. We act from unconscious habit and instinct. Consciousness falsifies reality by simplifying and categorizing what is actually complex and fluid. Both views challenge the Cartesian tradition that makes consciousness foundational and indubitable. Neither accepts that thinking proves a thinking substance exists. Consciousness is not a substance, but an activity, and a relatively superficial one at that. The relationship between appearance and reality takes different forms in each philosophy. Buddhism distinguishes conventional truth from ultimate truth without making appearance entirely illusory. Conventionally, persons and tables and trees exist and can be meaningfully discussed. Ultimately, only dependently originated phenomena empty of inherent existence exist. These two levels of truth complement rather than contradict each other. Nietzsche rejected any appearance-reality distinction that privileges one realm over another. Traditional metaphysics denigrates appearance by positing a true world behind phenomena. This true world was supposed to be eternal, unchanging, and accessible only through reason or revelation. Nietzsche proclaimed that this true world is a fable we should abandon. With the true world abolished, the apparent world also disappears as a category. We are left with simply the world as it presents itself in experience. This world is the only world, neither appearance nor reality, but simply what is. All interpretations are equally valid or invalid, since no true version exists for comparison. These metaphysical positions have ethical implications we will explore in subsequent sections. For now, recognize that their views of reality, self, and existence shape everything else. Part 4. The Psychology of Transformation. Methods and Practices. Both Nietzsche and Buddha offer therapeutic philosophies aimed at transforming human consciousness. They diagnose psychological problems and prescribe practices to address them. Yet their methods diverge as dramatically as their ultimate goals. The Buddha developed systematic training in ethics, meditation, and wisdom. Nietzsche offered provocative ideas, but no systematic practice regimen. Buddhist training begins with ethical conduct to stabilize the mind and reduce harm. The 5 precepts for laypeople prohibit killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, and intoxication. These restraints reduce guilt, anxiety, and social conflict that disturb mental peace. Monks and nuns adopt hundreds of additional rules regulating behavior in minute detail. This external discipline creates conditions conducive to internal transformation. The psychological rationale behind ethical precepts is sophisticated. Harmful actions generate remorse and fear of consequences that agitate the mind. An agitated mind cannot achieve the concentration required for deep meditation. Furthermore, harming others strengthens the delusion of separation between self and other. Ethical conduct weakens this delusion by cultivating empathy and care. Meditation forms the core of Buddhist transformative practice. Samatha. Meditation develops concentration by focusing attention on a single object. Common objects include the breath, a visual image, or a repeated phrase. When attention wanders, the meditator gently returns focus to the chosen object. Through sustained practice, concentration deepens into states called jhanas. Jhanas are absorbed concentration states characterized by profound tranquility and joy. 4 material jhanas involve progressively refined levels of concentration and equanimity. 4 immaterial jhanas transcend even subtle objects into boundless space, consciousness, nothingness, and beyond. These states provide temporary respite from suffering and strengthen the mind for insight practice. Vipassana meditation cultivates insight into the 3 characteristics of existence. Meditators observe phenomena arising and passing away in present moment experience. They note sensations in the body, emotions, thoughts and perceptions without judgment. Through sustained observation, the impermanent nature of all phenomena becomes viscerally apparent. This direct perception of impermanence leads to insight into suffering and no self. One sees that clinging to impermanent phenomena inevitably produces dissatisfaction. One recognizes that no stable self can be found within the constantly changing aggregates. These insights are not intellectual conclusions, but experiential realizations, transforming consciousness fundamentally. The progress of insight follows a predictable sequence documented in meditation manuals. Initial practice brings increased awareness of previously unnoticed mental and physical phenomena. Meditators often experience intense physical sensations, emotional releases, and vivid mental images. As practice deepens, phenomena appear to arise and pass away with increasing rapidity. Eventually, perception itself seems to disintegrate into discrete moments of consciousness. This can be frightening as ordinary reality dissolves into flux. Continued practice leads to a turning point called knowledge of the path. The meditator directly perceives nirvana as the unconditioned cessation of suffering. This marks stream entry, the first of 4 enlightenment stages in Theravada Buddhism. Stream enterers have eliminated certain fundamental defilements permanently. They can no longer believe in a permanent self or doubt the efficacy of the path. They will achieve full liberation within 7 lifetimes at most. Subsequent stages eliminate progressively deeper layers of craving and aversion. Once returners reduce sensual desire and ill will, but have not eliminated them completely. Non-returners eliminate these defilements entirely and will not be reborn in the sensual realm. Arhats achieve complete liberation, having eliminated all 10 fetters binding beings to suffering. Modern neuroscience has begun mapping the brain changes associated with meditation practice. Researchers have studied Tibetan monks with tens of thousands of hours of meditation experience. Brain imaging reveals increased gamma-wave activity during compassion meditation. These high-frequency oscillations indicate synchronized neural firing across distant brain regions. Long-term meditators show structural brain changes in regions associated with attention and emotion regulation. Increased grey matter density appears in the insula, which processes bodily sensations and emotional awareness. The prefrontal cortex, involved in executive control and decision-making, also shows increased volume. Simultaneously, the amygdala, which processes fear and threat detection, decreases in size. Studies of mindfulness meditation document changes in default mode network activity. This network activates during mind-wandering and self-referential thinking. Experienced meditators show reduced default mode network activity and increased connectivity with attention networks. This correlates with reduced rumination and enhanced present-moment awareness. Research on compassion meditation reveals increased activation in empathy-related brain regions. The anterior insular and anterior cingulate cortex respond more strongly to others' suffering. These findings suggest meditation can genuinely increase empathy and prosocial motivation. The Buddhists claim that practice transforms character receives scientific validation. Nietzsche offered no comparable systematic training method for consciousness transformation. He provided no meditation instructions, no ethical precepts, no stage path to enlightenment. Instead, he offered provocative ideas meant to shake readers from conventional thinking. His philosophy is diagnostic and therapeutic, but not prescriptive in the Buddhist sense. Nietzsche's method involves relentless self-examination and psychological honesty. One must excavate unconscious motives and drives that shape thought and behavior. This requires courage, because what one discovers may be unflattering or disturbing. We must acknowledge that morality often masks resentment, that compassion may hide weakness, that idealism can be cowardice. He advocated genealogical analysis to reveal hidden origins of values and beliefs. Where did your moral convictions come from, and what psychological needs do they serve? Tracing genealogy exposes how present values arose from past power struggles and psychological dynamics. This demystifies morality by showing its all-too-human origins. The eternal recurrence functions as a thought experiment for self-assessment and transformation. Ask yourself whether you would will the exact return of your life infinitely. If the answer is no, what would need to change for you to embrace eternal return? This question forces radical honesty about whether you truly affirm your existence. Someone incapable of embracing eternal recurrence lives inauthentically, fleeing from existence. They organize life around avoiding pain rather than creating value. They seek external validation rather than self-generated meaning. They remain trapped in reactive existence, driven by fear and resentment. Achieving amor fati requires reorganizing one's drives and values around life affirmation. This involves no technique, but rather a fundamental reorientation of attitude. One must cultivate what Nietzsche calls the Dionysian spirit that embraces chaos and becoming. This means accepting destruction as necessary for creation and suffering as fuel for growth. The concept of self-overcoming stands at the center of Nietzsche's transformative vision. One must perpetually surpass oneself, refusing to settle into comfortable stability. Every achievement becomes a platform for further striving rather than a resting place. This requires tremendous energy and vitality. what Nietzsche calls great health. Great health is not mere physical wellness, but a condition of psychological abundance. It involves robust drives organized into a powerful hierarchy, serving creative ends. The healthy person can withstand suffering and transform it into productive energy. They experience life intensely, embracing both ecstasy and agony without flinching. Nietzsche saw art as the highest form of this life-affirming activity. Art creates meaning through form and beauty without claiming metaphysical truth. It acknowledges life's horror while making existence aesthetically justified. The artist becomes the model for how humans should relate to existence. Comparing these approaches reveals profound methodological differences. Buddhism offers a clear path that anyone can follow through systematic practice. Millions have traversed this path over 2.5 millennia with documented results. The method is public, teachable, and relatively independent of cultural context. Nietzsche's approach remains radically individualistic and vague about practical implementation. How exactly does one achieve amor fati or organize one's drives? No practice tradition exists to guide aspirants beyond reading Nietzsche's writings. The philosophy inspires but provides little practical guidance for transformation. Yet Nietzsche's method has the advantage of engaging with active life rather than withdrawing from it. One need not renounce worldly activity or spend hours in meditation. The transformation occurs through creative work, relationships, and cultural engagement. This makes it more compatible with modern secular life than monastic Buddhism. Buddhist practice can be integrated into lay life through adapted forms. Mindfulness-based stress reduction programs teach meditation without Buddhist religious framework. These secular adaptations have proven effective for reducing anxiety, depression, and chronic pain. Millions benefit from meditation techniques stripped of their soteriological context. Critics argue these secularized versions lose Buddhism's radical transformative potential. Without the framework of dependent origination and no self, meditation becomes mere stress management. The goal shifts from liberation to improved functioning within samsara. This domesticates Buddhism into a therapeutic technique rather than a revolutionary philosophy. Similarly, Nietzsche's ideas have been popularized in self-help contexts with mixed results. Amor fati appears in motivational books as simple, positive thinking. Will to power gets reduced to personal empowerment and business success strategies. These adaptations capture superficial elements while missing the philosophical depth. The question remains whether consciousness transformation requires systematic practice or can emerge through ideas alone. Buddhist tradition overwhelmingly emphasizes practice over intellectual understanding. Merely knowing about no self does not liberate. One must realize it experientially through meditation. Insight arises from direct perception, not conceptual analysis. Nietzsche seemed to believe that ideas themselves could transform consciousness. The right thought at the right moment can shatter old patterns and enable new ones. Reading his works should provoke existential crisis that forces fundamental reorientation. The philosophy does its work through intellectual disruption rather than contemplative practice. Modern psychology offers evidence supporting both approaches. Cognitive therapy demonstrates that changing thought patterns can reduce suffering significantly. Identifying and challenging distorted thinking improves mood and functioning. This supports Nietzsche's emphasis on ideas and interpretations shaping experience. Simultaneously, contemplative practices produce effects distinct from cognitive interventions alone. Meditation alters brain structure and function in ways that talking therapy does not. The combination of cognitive work and meditative practice appears most effective. This suggests both thinkers captured partial truths about human transformation. Part 5. Ethics and Compassion. The moral question. The ethical visions of Nietzsche and Buddha stand in stark opposition. Their disagreement about morality follows inevitably from their divergent metaphysics and psychology. Buddhism grounds ethics in compassion and the elimination of suffering. Nietzsche critiques traditional morality as life-denying and advocates a revaluation of values. Compassion, karuna, occupies a central place in Buddhist ethics. All beings suffer and all deserve liberation from suffering. Recognizing our shared predicament generates natural sympathy and care for others. The boundaries between self and other dissolve when one understands no permanent self exists. Buddhist texts describe 4 sublime states called Brahma-viharas: loving-kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. Loving-kindness means wishing happiness and welfare for all beings without exception. Compassion involves the desire to relieve suffering wherever it appears. Sympathetic joy is happiness at others' good fortune rather than envy. Equanimity maintains balance and non-attachment toward all beings equally. These attitudes are not mere feelings, but are cultivated through systematic meditation practice. In metta-meditation, practitioners systematically extend loving-kindness to themselves, loved ones, neutral persons, difficult persons, and finally, all beings. The practice gradually breaks down the distinction between in-group and out-group. Research shows this increases prosocial behavior and reduces implicit bias. The ethical precepts in Buddhism derive from the principle of non-harming. Since all beings desire happiness and fear suffering, we should not cause harm. The first precept against killing applies to all sentient beings, not just humans. This extends Buddhist ethics to animals in ways Western traditions historically have not. Buddhist ethics operates through a consequentialist framework focused on mental states rather than external outcomes alone. Actions arising from greed, hatred, and delusion produce suffering for self and others. Actions arising from non-greed, non-hatred, and wisdom produce welfare and happiness. Karma means intentional action and its consequences across time. The doctrine of karma asserts that ethical causation is built into reality's fabric. Harmful intentions and actions plant seeds that ripen into suffering for the agent. Beneficial intentions and actions plant seeds that ripen into happiness. This occurs through natural processes, not divine judgment or supernatural punishment. Modern interpretations emphasize karma's psychological dimensions over metaphysical claims about rebirth. Harmful actions generate guilt, anxiety, and mental turbulence that cause suffering. They reinforce negative behavioral patterns that lead to adverse social consequences. Beneficial actions generate peace, confidence, and positive patterns that lead to favorable outcomes. Nietzsche launched his most aggressive attacks against this type of morality. He saw compassion as a subtle expression of the will to power in disguise. The compassionate person experiences superiority over the suffering person they help. Compassion involves assuming another's suffering, thereby multiplying total suffering in the world. More fundamentally, moralities based on compassion and non-harming represent slave morality. In his genealogy of morals, Nietzsche traced morality's origins to ressentiment among the powerless. Unable to directly attack their oppressors, slaves invented values that made powerlessness virtuous. They called their weakness patience, their inability to take revenge forgiveness, their cowardice compassion. Master morality, by contrast, affirms power, strength, nobility, and achievement. Masters determine what is good based on what enhances life and power. They experience no guilt about their dominance because they operate beyond good and evil. Their morality is life-affirming rather than life-denying. Christianity represented the triumph of slave morality through a remarkable psychological coup. Priests convinced the powerful to accept values invented by the weak. They introduced guilt, sin, and the bad conscience to make strength itself seem shameful. This priestly manipulation produced what Nietzsche called the sick animal, called man. Nietzsche praised Buddhism for avoiding Christianity's worst features. Buddhism does not burden people with original sin or concepts of eternal damnation. It treats suffering as a medical problem requiring hygienic solutions rather than moral failing requiring punishment. The Buddha functions more as physician than priest in Nietzsche's reading. Nevertheless, Buddhist compassion still represents a life-denying orientation for Nietzsche. It seeks to eliminate suffering rather than transform it into fuel for greatness. It promotes equality and universal compassion rather than rank order and excellence. It counsels non-harming when sometimes cruelty is necessary for creation. Nietzsche's positive ethics centers on self-overcoming and the creation of values. Beyond good and evil means beyond slave morality's dichotomy of good versus evil. The overman creates his own values based on life affirmation and will to power. These values need not align with conventional morality or universal principles. This raises the problem of moral chaos that critics have identified. If everyone creates their own values, what prevents murder, torture, and exploitation? Does Nietzsche's philosophy justify any action that enhances the agent's power? Nietzsche never satisfactorily answered this objection. Some scholars argue Nietzsche's ethics focuses on self-directed power rather than domination of others. The will to power primarily means overcoming oneself, not conquering external opponents. Self-overcoming requires discipline, creativity, and the transformation of drives into higher forms. This interpretation makes Nietzsche's ethics more defensible but perhaps less distinctive. Others contend Nietzsche genuinely advocated an ethics of strength that accepts inequality and hierarchy. Not all humans are equal in capability or worth. Excellence requires rare individuals to transcend the limitations of the herd. These exceptional beings should not be constrained by moral rules designed for mediocrity. Buddhist ethics faces different challenges from contemporary perspectives. The emphasis on non-harming can appear passive in the face of injustice. Should one refrain from violence when resisting oppression or protecting the innocent? Buddhist pacifism has been criticized as enabling evil through inaction. Furthermore, the doctrine of karma can blame victims for their suffering. If present suffering results from past bad karma, this seems to justify current inequalities. The poor deserve poverty, and the oppressed deserve oppression as karmic consequences. Contemporary engaged Buddhism has wrestled with these implications extensively. The Buddhist emphasis on equanimity might discourage passionate engagement with social problems. If all phenomena are empty and suffering inevitable in samsara, why work for justice? This worldly concerns seem trivial compared to the ultimate goal of liberation. Critics argue this produces political quietism incompatible with progressive values. Defenders respond that compassion necessarily entails active concern for others' welfare. Proper understanding of karma emphasizes present action rather than past causes. We cannot know others' karmic histories, but can reduce suffering in the present. Many Buddhists have engaged in social reform, political resistance, and humanitarian work. The Mahayana Bodhisattva ideal represents Buddhism's most other-directed ethical vision. Bodhisattvas vow to achieve enlightenment in order to liberate all sentient beings. They postpone final nirvana to remain in the world helping others. This represents supreme compassion and self-sacrifice for universal welfare. Nietzsche would have seen bodhisattva ethics as the ultimate expression of decadence. Sacrificing one's own development for the masses represents a squandering of potential. The exceptional individual owes nothing to the mediocre and should pursue greatness. Universal compassion levels everyone down to the lowest common denominator. From the Buddhist perspective, Nietzsche's ethics perpetuates the fundamental problem. It reinforces the sense of a separate self that must be enhanced and defended. This self-grasping directly causes suffering for oneself and others. True welfare comes from recognizing no self, not from strengthening egoic identity. Modern moral psychology offers insights into both positions. Research on empathy reveals it can be both prosocial and parochial. Empathy motivates helping, but primarily for in-group members. It can even increase hostility toward out-groups seen as threatening those we care about. Studies show that compassion meditation increases helping behavior more effectively than empathy alone. Compassion involves the motivation to relieve suffering without necessarily feeling others' pain. This makes it more sustainable and less prone to burnout than empathy. These findings support the Buddhist cultivation of compassion as distinct from mere empathy. Evolutionary biology explains moral sentiments through natural and sexual selection processes. Cooperation provided survival advantages in ancestral environments. Altruism toward kin increases inclusive fitness by helping genes survive. Reciprocal altruism benefits both parties in repeated interactions. Reputation and status accrue to those who help others. This evolutionary account aligns partially with Nietzsche's suspicion of altruism's motives. Even apparently selfless acts often serve self-interest in subtle ways. However, evolution also produced genuine capacities for empathy and care that transcend narrow self-interest. The debate continues about whether true altruism exists or reduces to sophisticated self-interest. Part 6. The Übermensch versus the Arhat. Ideals of human perfection. Nietzsche and Buddha present radically different visions of human perfection. The Übermensch represents Nietzsche's ideal of self-created greatness. The Arhat embodies Buddhist liberation from suffering through enlightenment. These ideals encapsulate everything distinctive about each philosophy. Nietzsche introduced the Übermensch in Thus Spoke Zarathustra as humanity's ultimate goal. The term translates as overman or superman, though both miss important connotations. Über means over or beyond, suggesting transcendence of current human limitations. The Übermensch is not a biological superman, but a spiritual and cultural ideal. Humans stand between animals and Übermensch, a bridge, not a destination. Animals act from instinct, without self-consciousness or values. Current humans possess consciousness, but remain bound by herd morality and life-denying values. The Übermensch transcends conventional humanity by creating meaning through sheer will. This figure embraces amor fati, willing the eternal recurrence of existence. He creates values rather than discovering them in some external authority. His morality arises from abundance and strength rather than weakness and resentment. He affirms life in its totality, including suffering, chaos, and destruction. Nietzsche intentionally provided no concrete description of what Übermensch would be like. He represents a potential, not a blueprint. Each person must create their own version through unique self-overcoming. Any attempt to define Übermensch precisely would contradict the philosophy's emphasis on radical individuality. The Übermensch has been catastrophically misinterpreted throughout history. Nazi ideology appropriated Nietzsche to justify racist doctrines and genocide. They read Übermensch as an Aryan racial type destined to dominate inferior peoples. This betrays everything Nietzsche intended, who explicitly opposed anti-Semitism and nationalism. Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth, married a prominent anti-Semite and edited his posthumous works. She selectively emphasized passages that could be read as supporting her husband's ideology. This distortion damaged Nietzsche's reputation for decades. Scholars have worked to recover Nietzsche's actual views from these perversions. The Übermensch represents individual rather than collective achievement. He is not a race or nation, but exceptional individuals appearing throughout history. Goethe, Beethoven, and Napoleon are mentioned as partial examples. Renaissance artists who combined creativity with life affirmation approached the ideal. Central to the Übermensch is the ability to organize drives into a coherent hierarchy. Lesser humans experience inner chaos, pulled in contradictory directions by competing impulses. The Übermensch achieves internal unity by subordinating lower drives to higher purposes. This requires tremendous psychological strength and self-mastery. The Arhat represents a fundamentally different ideal of perfection. The term means worthy one or one who has gone beyond. Arhats have achieved complete liberation from the cycle of suffering and rebirth. They have eliminated all 10 fetters binding beings to samsara. Early Buddhism distinguished 4 stages of enlightenment before arhatship. Stream enterers have eliminated belief in permanent self, doubt about the path, and attachment to rites and rituals. Once returners have significantly reduced sensual desire and ill will. Non-returners have eliminated these defilements completely and will not be reborn in the sensual realm. Arhats have eliminated the remaining fetters, including subtle forms of craving, conceit, and restlessness. The Arhat experiences no suffering because all craving has been extinguished. Physical pain may arise but causes no mental suffering because there is no resistance. Pleasant and unpleasant experiences come and go without generating attachment or aversion. Perfect equanimity prevails regardless of circumstances. This perfection includes extraordinary cognitive abilities and mental clarity. Arhats possess full understanding of the 4 noble truths and dependent origination. They directly perceive the 3 characteristics in all phenomena without conceptual mediation. Their wisdom is not theoretical knowledge, but lived experiential realization. Buddhist texts describe Arhats as possessing certain supernormal abilities called siddhis. These include telepathy, psychokinesis, and recollection of past lives. While emphasized in some traditions, these abilities are considered secondary to liberation itself. The Buddha warned against becoming attached to or displaying such powers. The Arhat radiates compassion naturally without effort or intention. Having transcended self-concern entirely, only care for others' welfare remains. This compassion operates spontaneously like water flowing downhill. No sense of being a compassionate person exists because no self exists. Mahayana Buddhism critiqued the Arhat ideal as too focused on personal liberation. The Bodhisattva emerged as a superior ideal, vowing to liberate all beings before entering final nirvana. This debate between Arhat and Bodhisattva ideals shaped Buddhist development for centuries. Theravada tradition defended the Arhat, while Mahayana emphasized the Bodhisattva. Both Arhat and Übermensch transcend ordinary human limitations, but in opposite directions. The Arhat achieves perfection through elimination and purification. The Übermensch achieves perfection through enhancement and creation. The Arhat subtracts all that is unwholesome. The Übermensch adds new values and capabilities. The Arhat has no desires or ambitions remaining. The Übermensch overflows with creative drive and powerful ambitions. The Arhat experiences perfect peace and equanimity. The Übermensch experiences intense engagement with life, including its extremes. From Nietzsche's perspective, the Arhat represents life-denying perfection. Having eliminated craving, the Arhat eliminates what makes life worthwhile. The resulting peace resembles death more than vibrant existence. This ideal appeals only to those exhausted by life and seeking escape. From the Buddhist perspective, the Übermensch represents egoic inflation. The entire project of self-overcoming and value creation rests on the delusion of a substantial self. This guarantees continued suffering no matter how elevated or refined the attainments. True freedom requires recognizing rather than enhancing the self. Modern psychology might frame this as a debate between self-actualization and self-transcendence. Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs places self-actualization at the pinnacle of human development. Self-actualized people realize their full potential and create meaningful lives. This aligns somewhat with Nietzsche's vision of self-overcoming. Later, Maslow added self-transcendence above self-actualization. Self-transcendent individuals go beyond personal concerns to identify with larger wholes. They experience peak experiences involving loss of ego boundaries and unity with existence. This aligns more closely with Buddhist ideals of no self and universal compassion. The question becomes whether these represent stages or competing alternatives. Perhaps one must first actualize the self before transcending it. Or perhaps pursuing self-actualization postpones the more important work of self-transcendence. Both Nietzsche and Buddha would reject compromise positions that dilute their radical visions. Part 7. The Science Connection. Neuroscience, Biology, and Psychology. Modern science illuminates both Nietzsche and Buddha in ways neither could have anticipated. Neuroscience reveals brain mechanisms underlying their insights about consciousness and self. Evolutionary biology explains the origins of drives and moral sentiments they analyzed philosophically. Cognitive science maps the mental processes they described introspectively. Buddhist claims about the constructed nature of self receive remarkable neuroscientific confirmation. The brain creates the illusion of a unified subject through distributed processes. No central location houses consciousness or directs mental activity. Instead, multiple modules process information in parallel and compete for dominance. Neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga's split-brain research demonstrated consciousness can be divided without subjective awareness. When the corpus callosum connecting brain hemispheres is severed, each hemisphere operates independently. The left hemisphere generates explanations for actions initiated by the right hemisphere. This reveals the interpreter module that creates coherent narratives about behavior after the fact. Research on the default mode network reveals neural correlates of self-referential thinking. This network activates when people engage in autobiographical memory or future planning. It includes the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and precuneus. Experienced meditators show reduced default mode network activity during practice. This correlates with decreased self-referential processing and enhanced present-moment awareness. Studies using functional magnetic resonance imaging have tracked changes from meditation practice over time. 8 weeks of mindfulness training produces measurable alterations in brain structure and function. The hippocampus shows increased grey matter density, improving memory and emotional regulation. The amygdala shows decreased grey matter density, reducing reactivity to threats and stressors. These structural changes persist beyond the training period, indicating lasting transformation. Research on advanced meditators reveals even more dramatic effects. Tibetan monks with over 10,000 hours of practice show extraordinary gamma wave synchronization during compassion meditation. These high-frequency oscillations indicate coordinated activity across widely distributed brain regions. Such synchronization rarely appears in ordinary consciousness, but characterizes focused attention and heightened awareness. The neuroscience of no-self extends to research on self-perception and agency. Benjamin Libet's famous experiments showed brain activity initiates voluntary actions before conscious awareness of intention. Readiness potentials appear in motor cortex hundreds of milliseconds before subjects report deciding to act. This suggests conscious will is an interpretation of unconscious processes rather than their cause. More recent work has complicated Libet's findings, but confirmed the general principle. Conscious intentions do not initiate action in the way we subjectively experience. The sense of authorship is constructed after motor commands have already been issued. This aligns with both Nietzsche's and Buddha's rejection of the free will doctrine. Nietzsche's insight about unconscious drives determining behavior preceded modern psychology by decades. Freud acknowledged Nietzsche's influence on his theory of unconscious motivation. Contemporary cognitive neuroscience has confirmed that most mental processing occurs outside awareness. Estimates suggest over 90% of brain activity remains unconscious. Research on implicit attitudes reveals how unconscious biases shape perception and behavior. People consciously endorse egalitarian values while harboring automatic prejudices against outgroups. These implicit attitudes predict behavior better than explicit self-reports in many contexts. The disconnect between conscious beliefs and unconscious processes supports Nietzsche's skepticism about rational self-knowledge. The neuroscience of emotion regulation validates aspects of both philosophical approaches. Emotion regulation strategies fall into two broad categories: cognitive reappraisal and attentional deployment. Cognitive reappraisal involves reinterpreting emotional stimuli to change their meaning. This aligns with Nietzsche's emphasis on perspective and interpretation shaping experience. Attentional deployment involves directing attention away from or toward emotional stimuli. Meditation practices cultivate attention control and non-reactive awareness of emotions. This aligns with Buddhist training in mindfulness and equanimity. Brain imaging shows these strategies activate different neural circuits with distinct effects. Evolutionary biology illuminates the origins of drives and moral sentiments both thinkers analyzed. Natural selection shaped human psychology to solve adaptive problems in ancestral environments. Status-seeking, coalition formation, and reciprocal altruism all served survival and reproductive functions. These evolved motivations operate largely outside conscious awareness and control. Nietzsche's will to power finds partial support in evolutionary perspectives on human motivation. Humans universally seek status and dominance because these predicted reproductive success ancestrally. Achieving high rank provided better access to resources and mates. This drive persists even when modern circumstances make it maladaptive. However, evolution also produced capacities for empathy and cooperation that enabled group living. Humans evolved as ultrasocial species dependent on coordination for survival. Empathy, fairness concerns, and punishment of free riders facilitated large-scale cooperation. These prosocial capacities support Buddhist emphasis on compassion as natural human potential. The debate between self-interest and altruism connects to evolutionary theories of cooperation. Kin selection explains altruism toward genetic relatives who share genes. Helping relatives survive ensures one's genes propagate even without personal reproduction. This accounts for extreme self-sacrifice parents make for children. Reciprocal altruism explains cooperation between non-relatives in repeated interactions. Helping others who will likely reciprocate benefits both parties over time. Reputation and indirect reciprocity extend this to larger social networks. Even apparently selfless acts often generate status and reciprocal benefits. Nevertheless, humans sometimes help strangers they will never encounter again at personal cost. This genuine altruism may result from misfiring of mechanisms adapted for small group living. Or it may reflect group selection pressures favoring cooperators over free riders. The evolutionary origins of true altruism remain contested among biologists. Cognitive science research on concepts and categories supports Nietzsche's perspectivism. The mind does not passively register reality, but actively constructs experience through conceptual frameworks. Different languages carve up color space differently, affecting color perception. Cultural models shape what people notice and how they interpret ambiguous situations. Research on motivated reasoning reveals how desires and goals bias information processing. People selectively attend to evidence supporting preferred conclusions while ignoring contradictory evidence. They generate sophisticated rationalizations for beliefs serving emotional needs. This confirms Nietzsche's claim that truth-seeking often masks will to power. Yet, cognitive science also reveals universal features of human cognition across cultures. All humans categorize objects, infer causal relationships, and attribute mental states to agents. These core cognitive capacities appear innate rather than culturally constructed. This suggests limits to perspectivism and cultural relativism. The psychology of suffering receives empirical support from research on hedonic adaptation. People rapidly return to baseline happiness levels after positive or negative life events. Lottery winners and accident victims show surprisingly similar life satisfaction after initial adjustment periods. This hedonic treadmill supports Buddha's claim that external conditions cannot provide lasting satisfaction. Research on desire and craving reveals the distinction between wanting and liking. These involve separate neural systems, with dopamine mediating wanting and opioids mediating liking. Addicts continue wanting drugs even when they no longer produce pleasure. This dissociation between desire and enjoyment confirms Buddhist analysis of craving's role in suffering. Studies of flow states and peak experiences validate aspects of both philosophies. Flow occurs during optimally challenging activities requiring full engagement. During flow, self-consciousness disappears and time perception distorts. People report these experiences as deeply meaningful and intrinsically rewarding. Flow states align with Nietzsche's vision of engaged, vital existence fully absorbed in activity. They also share features with meditative absorption states described in Buddhist texts. Both involve transcendence of ordinary self-consciousness through focused attention. This suggests different paths may reach similar states through distinct methods. Research on meaning and purpose reveals psychological benefits of having life goals. People with clear purposes report greater life satisfaction and better physical health. Meaning buffers against depression and anxiety during difficult circumstances. This supports Nietzsche's emphasis on creating values and purposes. However, research also shows that pursuing ego-focused goals provides less lasting satisfaction than pro-social goals. Helping others and contributing to larger causes predicts well-being better than personal achievement. This supports Buddhist emphasis on compassion and reducing self-concern. The neuroscience of compassion reveals it activates distinct circuits from empathy. Empathy activates pain networks, literally feeling others' suffering. Compassion activates reward and caregiving circuits associated with positive affect. This makes compassion more sustainable than empathy for helping professions. Training in compassion meditation increases activation in these positive affect circuits. It also enhances prosocial behavior and reduces implicit bias against outgroups. These findings support the Buddhist cultivation of compassion as trainable skill. They challenge the view that altruism is fixed by genes or early experience. Psychedelic research provides surprising connections to both philosophical traditions. Substances like psilocybin temporarily dissolve ego boundaries and self-other distinctions. Users report experiences of unity, transcendence, and dissolution of the separate self. These mystical experiences resemble descriptions in Buddhist meditation literature. Brain imaging during psychedelic states shows decreased default mode network connectivity. The same network that normally generates self-referential thinking becomes disrupted. This correlates with the subjective sense of ego dissolution and unity consciousness. Some researchers propose psychedelics could complement meditation for inducing transformative states. Long-term follow-up studies show lasting personality changes from psychedelic experiences. Users report increased openness, decreased authoritarianism, and enhanced concern for nature. These changes persist months after the acute drug effects have resolved. This suggests temporary ego dissolution can produce enduring shifts in values and perspective. However, psychedelics also carry risks of destabilizing effects and adverse reactions. Integration and preparation matter enormously for whether experiences prove beneficial or harmful. This highlights that altered states alone do not guarantee wisdom or transformation. The interpretive framework and subsequent practice determine long-term outcomes. Terror management theory provides evolutionary perspective on existential concerns. Awareness of mortality generates anxiety that humans manage through cultural worldviews and self-esteem. Cultures provide symbolic immortality through achievements that outlast physical death. Self-esteem buffers death anxiety by confirming one's value within cultural frameworks. This theory offers empirical support for Nietzsche's analysis of how values function. Cultural values are not discovered truths, but constructed defenses against meaninglessness. They serve psychological needs for security and significance in the face of death. Recognizing this undermines their claim to absolute validity. Yet, Terror management research also shows mortality reminders can increase both prosocial and antisocial behavior. Some people respond to death awareness with increased compassion and generosity. Others respond with hostility toward outgroups and defense of in-groups. The direction depends on prime values and cultural frameworks. Buddhist practices may offer alternative approaches to managing existential anxiety. Rather than symbolically transcending death, meditation confronts impermanence directly. Repeated observation of arising and passing away normalizes change and reduces fear. Accepting rather than denying mortality may reduce defensive reactions. The science reveals both philosophers captured genuine insights about human psychology. Their disagreements often reflect emphasizing different aspects of a complex reality. Neither offers a complete scientific theory, yet both identified patterns confirmed by research. Modern psychology benefits from integrating insights from both traditions. Part 8. Practical Applications and Real-World Impact. Both Nietzsche and Buddha have profoundly influenced how millions of people approach existence. Their ideas moved from abstract philosophy into lived practice with concrete consequences. Buddhism developed institutional forms supporting systematic application of its teachings. Nietzsche's influence remained more diffuse but equally transformative for culture and thought. Buddhism established monastic institutions that have preserved and transmitted practices for millennia. Monasteries provide environments optimized for meditation and study away from worldly distractions. Monks and nuns dedicate entire lives to intensive practice under guidance of experienced teachers. This institutional continuity enabled Buddhism to refine its methods through countless generations. The Sangha, community of practitioners, forms one of Buddhism's three jewels alongside Buddha and Dharma. This community provides social support, accountability, and collective wisdom for individual practice. Group meditation intensifies practice through shared intention and mutual encouragement. Senior practitioners guide newer ones through difficulties and pitfalls on the path. Buddhism spread from India throughout Asia, adapting to diverse cultural contexts. Theravada Buddhism flourished in Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, and Southeast Asia. Mahayana Buddhism developed distinctive forms in China, Korea, Japan, and Tibet. Each culture shaped Buddhist practice while being transformed by Buddhist values. In contemporary contexts, Buddhism has adapted to secular Western environments. Mindfulness-based stress reduction strips meditation of religious framework for clinical use. Developed by John Kabat-Zinn, in 1979, this program teaches meditation for pain and stress management. Thousands of studies document its effectiveness for diverse psychological and physical conditions. Mindfulness programs now operate in hospitals, schools, corporations, and prisons worldwide. Students learn meditation to improve focus and reduce test anxiety. Employees practice mindfulness to enhance productivity and reduce burnout. Inmates use meditation to manage anger and prepare for re-entry into society. Critics argue these applications commodify Buddhism and strip it of transformative potential. Corporate mindfulness serves capitalist productivity rather than liberation from suffering. It teaches people to accept oppressive conditions rather than challenge structural injustice. This domestication of Buddhism may undermine its radical critique of ordinary consciousness. Nevertheless, millions report genuine benefits from secularized Buddhist practices. Meditation reduces anxiety, depression, and chronic pain, even outside traditional religious contexts. People develop greater emotional regulation and psychological flexibility. These benefits are real, even if they fall short of enlightenment. Buddhist ethics have influenced environmental and animal rights movements significantly. Recognition of interdependence generates ecological consciousness and care for nature. The principle of non-harming extends moral consideration to all sentient beings. Buddhist activists have advocated for vegetarianism, conservation, and sustainable development. Engaged. Buddhism emerged in 20th century as socially active interpretation of practice. Figures like Thich Nhat Hanh integrated meditation with peace activism during the Vietnam War. The Dalai Lama has promoted nonviolent resistance and dialogue for Tibetan autonomy. Buddhist organizations work on poverty relief, education, and social justice globally. The practical impact of Buddhist psychology extends to therapeutic applications. Acceptance and commitment therapy incorporates mindfulness and psychological flexibility. Dialectical behavior therapy uses mindfulness for emotion regulation in borderline personality disorder. These therapies demonstrate Buddhist insights can enhance modern psychological treatment. Nietzsche's practical influence took entirely different forms, lacking institutional structure. His ideas spread through intellectual and artistic movements rather than organized communities. Existentialism, postmodernism, and depth psychology all drew heavily from Nietzsche's thought. His influence appears in literature, art, politics, and popular culture. Existentialist philosophers like Sartre, Camus, and Heidegger developed themes from Nietzsche's work. The emphasis on radical freedom, authentic existence, and self-creation derives from his philosophy. Sartre's claim that existence precedes essence echoes Nietzsche's rejection of fixed human nature. Camus' absurdism confronts meaninglessness in ways inspired by Nietzsche's nihilism analysis. Postmodern thinkers like Foucault and Derrida employed genealogical methods Nietzsche pioneered. Foucault traced how power relations shape knowledge and constitute subjects. Derrida deconstructed binary oppositions to reveal hidden hierarchies in Western thought. Both approaches owe profound debts to Nietzsche's critique of metaphysics and morality. Depth psychology incorporated Nietzsche's insights about unconscious drives and motivation. Freud acknowledged Nietzsche anticipated psychoanalytic discoveries about the unconscious. Jung's concept of the shadow resembles Nietzsche's analysis of repressed instincts. Adler's individual psychology explicitly adopted will to power as fundamental human motivation. Artists and writers embraced Nietzsche as inspiration for creative experimentation and transgression. The modernist movement in literature and art reflects his influence throughout. Writers like Thomas Mann, Hermann Hesse, and James Joyce engage deeply with Nietzsche's ideas. His celebration of Dionysian creativity against Apollonian order shaped artistic movements. Political appropriations of Nietzsche have been numerous and often distorted. The Nazis catastrophically misused his philosophy to justify totalitarianism and genocide. This appropriation required ignoring Nietzsche's explicit opposition to nationalism and anti-Semitism. His sister's editorial manipulations facilitated this distortion of his actual views. Left-wing thinkers have also claimed Nietzsche as supporting revolutionary transformation. His critique of conventional morality can be read as challenging bourgeois values. The emphasis on self-overcoming resonates with Marxist notions of human self-development. However, Nietzsche despised socialism as another form of herd morality. Contemporary self-help movements have popularized simplified versions of Nietzsche's ideas. Amor fati appears as advice to accept and embrace whatever happens. Will to power gets reduced to personal empowerment and manifestation techniques. These applications capture superficial elements while missing philosophical depth and rigor. Nietzsche's influence on psychology extends to positive psychology and humanistic approaches. Abraham Maslow's hierarchy, culminating in self-actualization, reflects Nietzschean themes. Viktor Frankl's logotherapy emphasizes creating meaning through choosing attitudes toward circumstances. These therapeutic approaches advocate active construction of values and purposes. The concept of authentic existence drawn from Nietzsche shapes contemporary psychotherapy. Therapists encourage clients to examine whether they live according to genuine values or external expectations. Authenticity requires taking responsibility for choices rather than blaming circumstances or others. This emphasis on radical responsibility derives from existential philosophy rooted in Nietzsche. Education has been influenced by both thinkers in distinct ways. Contemplative education programs introduce meditation into curricula from elementary through university levels. Students learn mindfulness to improve attention, reduce stress, and develop emotional intelligence. Research shows these programs enhance academic performance and social-emotional skills. Nietzschean themes appear in educational philosophy, emphasizing creativity and critical thinking. Progressive education movements advocate self-directed learning over passive reception of information. Students should question authority and develop independent perspectives rather than memorizing dogma. This critical pedagogy owes debts to Nietzsche's emphasis on intellectual courage and independence. Both philosophies influence how people approach suffering in contemporary life. Buddhist-inspired approaches counsel accepting and observing pain without adding mental resistance. This reduces secondary suffering caused by fighting against unavoidable circumstances. Mindfulness helps people distinguish between pain itself and amplifying mental reactions to pain. Nietzsche-inspired approaches counsel transforming suffering into fuel for growth and meaning. Rather than eliminating suffering, one should extract value and lessons from difficulties. Adversity becomes opportunity for developing strength and deepening character. This reframing helps people find purpose in unavoidable hardships. The practical question becomes which approach suits different circumstances and individuals. Accepting circumstances beyond one's control reduces futile struggle and conserves energy. Actively striving to overcome obstacles builds competence and achieves concrete goals. Wisdom involves discerning when acceptance serves better than action, and vice versa. Both traditions emphasize practice over mere intellectual understanding. Buddhist meditation requires sustained daily effort over years to produce significant results. Nietzschean self-overcoming demands ongoing confrontation with one's limitations and fears. Neither offers quick fixes or guarantees of success. The institutional advantage Buddhism possesses enables systematic transmission across generations. Teachers guide students through predictable challenges and prevent common mistakes. Texts preserve detailed instructions for practices and map stages of progress. Community support sustains motivation during difficult periods. Nietzsche's individualistic approach lacks these structural supports, but offers different advantages. Practitioners need not adopt foreign cultural frameworks or religious beliefs. The philosophy integrates naturally with active engagement in worldly pursuits. It celebrates rather than renounces creative achievement and cultural contribution. Contemporary culture shows influence from both traditions in tension with each other. Mindfulness apps and meditation centers proliferate alongside self-help books on personal empowerment. People seek both inner peace through acceptance and external achievement through striving. This reflects genuine human needs for both serenity and significance. The practical impact of these philosophies will likely continue evolving in coming decades. As scientific understanding advances, we may better integrate insights from both traditions. New synthesis could combine Buddhist psychological techniques with Nietzschean cultural creativity, or deepening understanding may reveal their fundamental incompatibility more clearly. Part 9. Major critiques, limitations, and scholarly debates. Both philosophies face serious critiques from scholars and practitioners across multiple dimensions. Their internal tensions, logical problems, and practical limitations deserve rigorous examination. No philosophy escapes criticism, and intellectual honesty requires confronting weaknesses alongside strengths. Buddhism's doctrine of no-self faces the problem of accounting for reincarnation without a persistent identity. If no permanent self exists, what transmigrates from life to life, accumulating karma? Buddhist philosophers developed complex theories of momentary consciousness streams and subtle continuity. Critics argue these solutions reintroduce precisely what no self denies under different terminology. The concept of nirvana remains philosophically obscure despite 2 millennia of exposition. Describing it through negations avoids positive characterization that might clarify its nature. Is nirvana a state, an experience, or complete cessation of experience? Different Buddhist schools offer incompatible answers, suggesting fundamental ambiguity in the concept itself. The empirical claims about karma and rebirth lack scientific verification. Modern Buddhism often reinterprets karma psychologically rather than metaphysically. But traditional Buddhism clearly asserted literal rebirth across multiple realms of existence. Abandoning these doctrines may undermine the entire soteriological framework's coherence. Buddhist ethics faces charges of passivity and political quietism. If all conditioned existence is unsatisfactory and liberation lies beyond worldly concerns, why engage with social justice? The emphasis on individual enlightenment may neglect collective liberation and structural oppression. Critics argue Buddhism historically supported oppressive social hierarchies through karmic fatalism. The doctrine of dependent origination may be ultimately unintelligible. If everything arises dependent on conditions, including the principle of dependent origination itself, circularity threatens. What grounds the causal principle if it applies universally without exception? Some philosophers argue Buddhism collapses into incoherence when pushed to logical limits. Buddhist meditation practices carry risks that traditional sources acknowledge, but Western adaptations often downplay. Intensive practice can precipitate psychotic breaks, dissociative states, and emotional crises. The so-called dark night of the soul involves profound existential terror and meaninglessness. Teachers must skillfully guide students through these dangerous passages. The secularization of Buddhism for therapeutic purposes may corrupt its essence. Mindfulness becomes another technique for optimizing performance within samsara rather than escaping it. This domestication serves capitalist productivity and individual adjustment rather than radical transformation. The Dharma gets reduced to stress management and self-help. Scholarly debates continue about whether early Buddhism was truly atheistic and non-metaphysical. The Buddha refused to answer certain metaphysical questions, but never denied gods or cosmology. Early texts contain extensive cosmology describing multiple realms and supernatural beings. Modern interpretations often minimize these elements to make Buddhism palatable to scientific worldviews. The relationship between Theravada and Mahayana traditions remains contentious. Mahayana critiques Theravada as Hinayana, lesser vehicle, focused selfishly on personal liberation. Theravada defenders argue Mahayana innovations departed from Buddha's original teachings. These sectarian disputes reveal tensions within Buddhism about its core message. Nietzsche's philosophy faces equally serious objections from multiple angles. The most damaging charge accuses his thought of enabling or justifying oppression and violence. If traditional morality is rejected and power becomes the standard, what prevents might making right? Nietzsche never adequately addressed how his philosophy avoids descending into barbarism. The concept of will to power remains frustratingly vague and unfalsifiable. If every action manifests will to power, the concept explains nothing by explaining everything. Nietzsche never clarified whether will to power operates as psychological description or metaphysical principle. His unpublished notebooks suggest cosmological ambitions. His published works leave ambiguous. The eternal recurrence faces insurmountable scientific problems if taken literally. Thermodynamics shows closed systems increase entropy irreversibly toward heat death. Nietzsche's argument for recurrence based on finite matter and infinite time fails. Most scholars interpret recurrence as thought experiment rather than cosmological claim. But Nietzsche himself seemed to believe in its physical reality, at least at times. The tension between determinism and responsibility pervades Nietzsche's philosophy without resolution. If unconscious drives determine behavior and free will is illusion, how can anyone be responsible? Yet Nietzsche constantly praises and blames individuals for their choices and character. This apparent contradiction undermines his ethical and psychological theories. Nietzsche's critique of compassion and equality appears morally repugnant to many readers. His attack on democratic values and celebration of hierarchy conflict with modern ethical sensibilities. While he opposed nationalism and racism, his aristocratic radicalism sits uncomfortably with egalitarian commitments. Some argue his philosophy inherently trends toward elitism and indifference to suffering. The absence of systematic method makes Nietzsche's philosophy difficult to evaluate rigorously. He offers brilliant aphorisms and provocative claims without sustained argumentation. His rhetorical style privileges persuasion over logical demonstration. This makes it unclear how to adjudicate disputes about his actual positions. Nietzsche's psychological self-understanding appears compromised by his mental breakdown. He claimed to possess great health while suffering from severe illness throughout life. His final writings show increasing grandiosity and paranoia before collapsing into madness. This raises questions about whether his philosophy reflects genuine wisdom or pathology. Scholarly interpretations of Nietzsche remain deeply divided on fundamental questions. Some read him as proto-fascist, celebrating domination and cruelty. Others read him as liberatory figure, attacking all forms of oppression and dogma. These competing readings cannot both be correct, yet both find textual support. The relationship between Nietzsche's early and late periods raises continuity questions. His early work celebrated Wagner and Schopenhauer, whom he later repudiated viciously. Did his philosophy undergo fundamental transformation or merely surface-level revisions? Scholars disagree about which writings represent his mature, considered views. Both philosophies struggle with the problem of grounding their ethical claims. Buddhism grounds ethics in reducing suffering, but never adequately justifies why suffering is bad. If no self exists to suffer, why does suffering matter ultimately? The framework presupposes rather than proves the ethical significance of suffering. Nietzsche grounds ethics in life affirmation, but never explains why life should be affirmed. His appeals to health, strength and power simply assert values without justification. Someone who rejected these values would find no purchase in his arguments. Both philosophies ultimately rest on intuitions they cannot prove to skeptics. The practical limitations of both approaches become apparent in application. Buddhist enlightenment remains extraordinarily rare even among dedicated lifelong practitioners. Most meditators achieve modest benefits rather than radical transformation. This suggests the path may be far less reliable than traditional claims suggest. Nietzschean self-overcoming lacks clear criteria for success or methods for achievement. Without systematic practice or community support, individuals flounder seeking amor fati. The philosophy inspires but provides insufficient guidance for concrete implementation. This may explain why Nietzsche's impact remains primarily intellectual rather than practical. Both face the charge of being fundamentally world-denying despite surface differences. Buddhism explicitly seeks liberation from conditioned existence. Nietzsche's eternal recurrence affirms existence, but only the same existence, repeating infinitely. Neither embraces genuine novelty, creativity, or openness to undetermined futures. Contemporary philosophers debate whether either philosophy remains viable given modern knowledge. Scientific understanding of evolution, neuroscience, and cosmology may undermine their foundations, or perhaps these philosophies address existential questions science cannot touch. The relationship between philosophy and science itself becomes contested in evaluating these systems. Feminist philosophers have critiqued both traditions for patriarchal assumptions and marginalization of women. Buddhism historically restricted women's access to ordination and leadership. Nietzsche made explicitly misogynistic statements throughout his writings. Both require substantial reconstruction to align with contemporary gender egalitarianism. Post-colonial scholars note how Western interpretations of Buddhism often distort Asian traditions. The construction of Buddhism as purely philosophical rather than religious serves Western preferences. This strips Buddhism of cultural context and lived practices embedded in Asian societies. The mindfulness movement exemplifies cultural appropriation, extracting techniques from their origins. The ecological implications of both philosophies remain ambiguous and contested. Buddhism's emphasis on non-harming supports environmental protection and animal welfare, but its goal of liberation from existence may devalue earthly concerns, including nature. Nietzsche's celebration of power and overcoming could justify exploitation of nature for human ends, or his critique of anthropocentrism might support ecological humility and restraint. Neither philosophy adequately addresses the reality of radical interdependence and systemic causation. Both focus heavily on individual transformation rather than collective liberation. Contemporary problems like climate change and economic inequality require coordinated social action. Philosophies centered on individual enlightenment or self-creation may prove inadequate for collective challenges. Part 10. The final confrontation, synthesis and verdict. We arrive at the fundamental question. Which philosophy offers the more accurate and viable response to human existence? This requires synthesizing insights across all dimensions we have examined. The answer may involve neither simple victory nor facile synthesis, but rather recognition of genuine incommensurability. Both philosophers correctly identified suffering as central to human experience, requiring philosophical address. Both recognized that conventional religious and moral frameworks had become inadequate. Both saw that transformation of consciousness rather than external changes offered the deepest solution. Their diagnostic agreement establishes common ground despite opposing prescriptions. The core disagreement centers on whether existence itself should be affirmed or transcended. Nietzsche demands total affirmation of becoming, including suffering and destruction. Buddha teaches that conditioned existence is ultimately unsatisfactory and should be transcended. These represent genuinely incompatible existential orientations that cannot both be fully correct. Modern science provides partial vindication for both positions simultaneously. Neuroscience confirms Buddhist insights about the constructed nature of self and efficacy of meditation. Evolutionary psychology validates Nietzschean emphasis on drives, power-seeking, and unconscious motivation. The brain operates largely as both described, suggesting each captured different aspects of psychological reality. The Buddhist analysis of suffering's mechanics appears more scientifically accurate than Nietzsche's. Craving and attachment do generate much human misery through predictable psychological mechanisms. Research on desire, hedonic adaptation, and meaning confirms that external attainments provide limited satisfaction. The hedonic treadmill operates as Buddha described 25 centuries ago. However, Nietzsche correctly identified that drives and desires constitute rather than merely corrupt human nature. Complete elimination of craving would require such radical alteration that the resulting being hardly counts as human. Evolution shaped us as wanting, striving creatures for whom desire drives survival and reproduction. This suggests Buddhist liberation may be biologically implausible for most people. The practical effectiveness of Buddhist methods has been empirically demonstrated more clearly than Nietzschean approaches. Meditation reliably reduces suffering and increases well-being according to numerous studies. The systematic path provides concrete practices that millions have successfully applied. Nietzsche offers inspiration but no comparable method for transformation. Yet Buddhism's practical success may come at the cost Nietzsche identified: reduction of vitality and engagement. Meditation cultivates equanimity and detachment that can shade into apathy and withdrawal. The most dedicated practitioners often renounce worldly achievement and creative contribution. This withdrawal may represent exactly the life negation Nietzsche diagnosed. The question becomes whether vitality and creative engagement necessarily involve suffering. Nietzsche argued that great achievement requires accepting associated pain and struggle. Buddha suggested that craving rather than activity itself generates suffering. One might act vigorously without attachment to outcomes, enjoying process rather than seeking results. This points toward a possible synthesis that neither philosopher explicitly endorsed. Perhaps wisdom involves discerning which desires serve flourishing and which perpetuate suffering needlessly. Not all wanting equals the problematic craving Buddha identified. Not all acceptance equals the life denial Nietzsche attacked. Contemporary positive psychology suggests human flourishing requires both hedonia and eudaimonia. Hedonia involves pleasure and positive emotions in the present moment. Eudaimonia involves meaning, growth, and realization of potential over time. Balanced lives include both dimensions, rather than exclusively pursuing one. Buddhist practice cultivates hedonic well-being through equanimity and non-reactivity to circumstances. Nietzschean self-overcoming cultivates eudaimonic well-being through meaningful projects and achievement. Perhaps optimal human development requires integrating both approaches judiciously. This synthesis would honor truth in each philosophy while avoiding their respective extremes. The ethical question admits no easy resolution between their opposing values. Universal compassion and hierarchy of excellence represent conflicting moral visions. Contemporary ethics generally sides with Buddhism's egalitarianism over Nietzsche's aristocratic radicalism. Yet something troubling remains in reducing all value to preventing suffering. Human achievements in art, science, and culture do seem to possess intrinsic worth beyond their effects on suffering. A universe containing Mozart's compositions and Einstein's discoveries appears more valuable than one without them. This intuition supports Nietzsche's emphasis on excellence and creativity as values. But this must be balanced against causing suffering to others in pursuing greatness. The Buddhist framework provides clearer ethical guidance through principles of non-harming and compassion. Nietzsche offers no systematic ethics, and his fragmentary suggestions often appear morally troubling. For practical ethics guiding behavior in complex social situations, Buddhism proves more reliable. For inspiring individuals to transcend mediocrity and create value, Nietzsche proves more effective. The metaphysical questions they addressed may ultimately exceed philosophy's capacity to definitively resolve. Whether reality possesses inherent meaning or consists only of interpreted perspectives cannot be conclusively determined. Whether consciousness continues after death or not remains empirically inaccessible to living investigators. Both philosophies make claims that exceed what evidence can verify or falsify. This suggests that choosing between them may involve existential commitment rather than intellectual demonstration. Some people resonate deeply with Buddhist teachings and find them transformatively true. Others find Nietzsche's philosophy liberating and illuminating in ways Buddhism is not. Temperament, life experience and values shape which philosophy speaks to individual circumstances. The historical impact of both philosophies demonstrates their enduring power despite limitations. Buddhism shaped Asian civilizations for millennia and now influences global culture. Nietzsche transformed Western philosophy and culture from existentialism through postmodernism. Both provoked fundamental rethinking of what it means to be human. Their continuing relevance derives from addressing perennial human concerns that science alone cannot resolve. How should we relate to suffering, mortality, meaning and value in our lives? These existential questions admit multiple reasonable responses reflecting different priorities and assumptions. Neither Nietzsche nor Buddha provided final answers applicable to all people in all circumstances. A mature philosophical stance may recognize truth in both while remaining critical of each. Buddhist analysis of suffering and methods for reducing it offer genuine value. Nietzsche's celebration of creativity and critique of life denial contain important insights. We need not choose exclusively, but can learn from both selectively. The ideal might combine Buddhist psychological techniques with Nietzschean cultural engagement. Meditation provides tools for managing reactivity and cultivating equanimity. Creative work and meaningful projects provide purpose and self-expression. Compassion guides ethical behavior, while excellence inspires achievement. This synthesis would reject Buddhist withdrawal from worldly activity as unnecessary for liberation. One can engage fully with life while maintaining non-attachment to outcomes. It would also reject Nietzsche's dismissal of compassion as weakness or decadence. Empathy and care represent sophisticated capacities rather than failures of strength. The resulting philosophy would be neither Buddhist nor Nietzschean, but rather pragmatic integration. It would draw tools and insights from both without dogmatic adherence to either system. This approach respects wisdom in traditional philosophies while adapting them for contemporary contexts. It acknowledges that ancient thinkers captured important truths while remaining fallible and limited. The deepest disagreement may prove irresolvable within philosophical discourse itself. Whether to affirm or transcend existence represents an existential choice rather than factual question. Different life experiences lead reasonable people to opposite conclusions. Someone who has suffered greatly may find Buddhist liberation compelling. Someone who has experienced profound joy in creative achievement may embrace Nietzschean affirmation. Perhaps the ultimate wisdom involves recognizing the limitations of any single philosophical system. Human existence is too complex and multifaceted for one perspective to capture completely. We need multiple frameworks to address different dimensions and situations. The search for a final, definitive philosophy may itself reflect the metaphysical thinking both thinkers criticized. In the end, both Nietzsche and Buddha offer powerful resources for confronting existence. Their disagreement clarifies the fundamental choices facing any philosophical anthropology. Do we view humans primarily as suffering beings seeking liberation or creative beings seeking expression? Is the goal to eliminate craving or to organize drives into productive hierarchies? Should we transcend the world or transform our relationship to it? These questions have no single correct answer applicable across all contexts and individuals. Different answers suit different temperaments, circumstances, and life stages. A comprehensive philosophy of human existence might acknowledge this pluralism rather than forcing uniformity. Both Buddha and Nietzsche illuminate paths through existence without exhausting the possibilities. The confrontation between them ultimately enriches, rather than resolves, philosophical inquiry. By understanding their disagreement deeply, we clarify our own choices and values. We recognize the stakes involved in how we relate to suffering, meaning, and existence itself. This recognition represents the true value of bringing these titans into dialogue. Neither emerges as simple victor because both captured partial truths about human reality. Their opposition reflects a genuine tension in existence itself that philosophy cannot eliminate. We must hold this tension and navigate between extremes rather than collapsing into one side. This difficult balance represents the philosophical wisdom appropriate to our complex condition. The journey through their confrontation reveals more questions than answers. This may be the deepest teaching. Existence resists simple solutions and final explanations. Both Buddha and Nietzsche understood this in their own ways. Their philosophies point beyond themselves toward the mystery that remains when all systems fail. We close where we began, with two extraordinary humans confronting suffering and mortality. Their responses differ radically, yet both command respect for depth and seriousness. In studying their confrontation, we do not resolve it, but rather enter into it ourselves. This is the path toward whatever wisdom remains available to finite beings in an ambiguous universe.